My husband died 5 years ago. He left a sealed envelope, open strictly in 2026. Yesterday, I opened it. Inside was a note. Go to the garage. There is a secret room under the floor. When I found it and went down, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 71 years old. I have lived in the same house in Millbrook, Ohio for 43 years. I raised 2 sons in that house, buried a husband from that house, and sat on the back porch of that house every single morning with a cup of black coffee and watched the light change over the yard, the way only someone with nowhere urgent to be can afford to do. People in town called me steady. My pastor called me resilient. My neighbor Ruth called me stubborn, but she meant it kindly. I called myself tired most days, but the quiet kind of tired, the kind that comes after a long life well lived, not the kind that frightens you. Harold and I had been married for 47 years when he died. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the way that particular disease tends to be. In March, he told me his back hurt. By August, he was gone. I didn't have time to prepare, and I'm not sure preparation would have helped anyway. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, no matter how much warning you receive. Harold was a good man, a quiet man. He worked for 30 years at the county assessor's office, knew property values the way other men know baseball statistics, and spent his weekends puttering in the garage or tending the vegetable garden along the south fence. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He showed love through actions. A filled gas tank, a replaced smoke detector battery, a cup of coffee waiting on the counter before I even came downstairs. I trusted him completely. I never had a reason not to. After he died, his son from his first marriage, Garrett, came to the funeral with his wife, Pamela. I want to be careful here, because I was raised to speak kindly about the living. But I will say this. Garrett had always looked at Harold's property the way a man looks at something he believes should belong to him. He was civil to me at the funeral. He shook my hand and said the right words, but his eyes moved around my living room like an appraiser's, and Pamela kept asking, in that gentle, suggestive way she had, whether I'd thought about what comes next. I was 58 days a widow at that point. I had not thought about what comes next. I was still thinking about what had just ended. Harold left a will. It was straightforward. The house and everything in it passed to me. The savings account, the small retirement fund, the car, all to me. Garrett received a modest sum, which Harold had set aside years earlier. It was not nothing. It was not what Garrett had apparently expected. He didn't contest the will, but the atmosphere between us changed after the reading. The phone calls became less frequent, then stopped entirely. I told myself that was natural. I told myself grief makes people strange. Life settled into its new shape. I planted the garden in spring. I had Ruth over for dinner on Thursdays. I learned to manage the finances Harold had always handled, discovered I was competent at it, and felt a complicated pride about that discovery. The years passed, 5 of them. And then, last April, I was sorting through the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, looking for a quilt I wanted to give to my granddaughter, and I found the envelope. It had been there the whole time, tucked beneath Harold's old wool sweater, sealed with tape, and written on in his careful hand, open strictly in 2026. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I turned the envelope over and over. It was 2026. It was April of 2026, and Harold had died in 2021, and he had known, had planned, had decided that there was something I should not know for 5 years. Why 5 years? Why not immediately in the will with the lawyer present? Why hide it in a cedar chest like a secret passed between strangers? I didn't open it that night. I put it on the kitchen table and I made dinner and I watched the evening news and I went to bed and I lay in the dark and I thought, Harold, what did you do? The next morning I opened it. The note inside was written on a single index card in his neat, small handwriting. It said, Dot, go to the garage. Under the floor there is a hidden room. I'm sorry I waited. I needed to be sure you were safe first. Everything inside belongs to you. I read it 3 times. Then I put on my coat, walked across the yard in the early morning cold, and opened the garage door. The garage smelled the way it always had. Motor oil, dry wood, the faint ghost of fertilizer from the bags Harold kept stacked against the back wall. His workbench was still there. Tools arranged with the precision of a man who believed order was a form of respect. His old riding mower sat in the corner under a canvas tarp. Nothing had changed. I had not changed anything because I hadn't been able to bring myself to, and also because I hadn't had a reason to. I stood in the center of the concrete floor and looked down. The floor was solid, unbroken. Or so it appeared. I walked slowly, the way Harold used to walk when he was looking for something he'd misplaced, methodical and patient. And then, in the far left corner, behind the stack of fertilizer bags, I found it. A seam in the concrete, barely visible. A square, roughly 4 feet across, with a recessed metal ring flush with the surface, painted over to match the surrounding floor. My heart was doing something uncomfortable in my chest. I am a practical woman, and I want to state clearly that I was frightened. Not of something supernatural. I am 71 years old and I have no patience for that kind of fear. But of something real. Of what it might mean that my husband of 47 years had built a hidden room beneath our garage and told no one about it for as long as I had known him. I pulled the fertilizer bags aside. I gripped the ring with both hands. The hatch was heavy, but it moved. It had been recently oiled, which meant Harold had maintained it even in the months when he was already sick, when every movement cost him something. That detail hit me harder than I expected. He had come out here, in pain, and kept this secret ready. Beneath the hatch, a wooden ladder descended into darkness. I found a flashlight on Harold's workbench. Of course he'd left one there. Of course he'd thought of that. And I climbed down. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. Dry, surprisingly. The walls were lined with wooden shelving, and on those shelves were banker's boxes, perhaps a dozen of them, labeled in Harold's handwriting. There was also a fireproof safe bolted to the floor, a manila envelope taped to its top, and a folding chair positioned in front of it, as though Harold had imagined me sitting there, taking my time. I sat down. I opened the manila envelope first. Inside was a letter, 4 pages in Harold's handwriting, and a separate sheet with a combination. The letter began, Dot, I need to tell you about the Reardon property. I won't recount every word here. But the substance of it was this. In 1987, Harold's father had left him a parcel of land, 11 acres outside of town, near the old Reardon farm road. Harold had never told me because at the time there had been a legal dispute with his brother's estate, and the land had been tied up in litigation. Then the litigation had resolved in Harold's favor, quietly in 1994, and Harold had meant to tell me. But by then he had begun to understand that Garrett, his son from his first marriage, then a teenager, had somehow learned about the land and believed it was coming to him. Harold had said nothing. He had waited. He had watched Garrett's behavior over the years and concluded, slowly and with grief, that Garrett would contest any claim I made to that land the moment Harold was gone. The land, according to the assessor's records Harold had kept in the boxes, was now worth considerably more than 11 acres of Ohio farmland had any right to be. A commercial developer had been buying up parcels in the area for nearly a decade. Harold's 11 acres sat at the center of the projected development corridor. Its assessed value, as of Harold's last research in 2020, was approximately $2.3 million. I sat in that underground room for a long time. The flashlight sat on the shelf beside me, aimed at the ceiling so the light diffused softly, the way Harold used to angle his reading lamp so it wouldn't bother me when I was sleeping. I thought about 47 years of marriage. I thought about the word safe in his note. I needed to be sure you were safe first. 5 years. He had calculated that 5 years was enough time for Garrett to have moved on, stopped watching, stopped waiting. Was he right? I didn't know. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not going to let this go. Not out of greed. I want that understood. I am not a greedy woman. But Harold had preserved this for me, carefully and at great personal cost, and I was going to honor that. I climbed back up the ladder with the manila envelope tucked under my arm. I replaced the hatch. I put the fertilizer bags back exactly as they were. Then I went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table to think. The first thing I needed was a lawyer. Not the family lawyer who had handled Harold's will. A firm Garrett knew, a firm with connections to Harold's old life. I needed someone new, someone who had no prior relationship with anyone in this situation. I called Ruth that afternoon, not to tell her everything, not yet, but because Ruth's daughter-in-law was a paralegal in Columbus and I needed a name. Ruth's daughter-in-law gave me the name of an attorney named Susan Hart, a property and estate lawyer based in Columbus with 20 years of experience, and, Ruth assured me, a reputation for being thorough. I called her office the following Monday morning and made an appointment for Thursday. I told no one else. I went about my week as normally as I was capable of, watering the garden, going to the grocery store, calling my younger son Patrick to chat about his children. And I kept the manila envelope locked in the small fireproof box I kept in my bedroom closet, the one I'd always used for passports and birth certificates. Susan Hart's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps mid-40s, with a focused, unhurried manner that I liked immediately. I sat across from her desk, folded my hands in my lap, and told her everything. I showed her Harold's letter. I showed her the combination to the safe. I had opened it the day before and found the original deed to the land, the litigation settlement documents from 1994, and a folder of recent appraisal printouts Harold had downloaded and annotated. Susan read through everything with the careful patience of someone who understood that the document in her hands might matter in court. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Mrs. Callahan, do you understand what you have here?" "I believe I do," I said. "This deed is clean. The settlement is valid. The land is yours by right of inheritance through your husband's estate. There is no legitimate challenge available to anyone, provided we file correctly and promptly." She explained the process. We would file a claim with the county to formally transfer the deed into my name. which should have been done at Harold's death, but had not been because no one knew about it. We would simultaneously request a title search to document the land's history and current value. We would be careful. We would be quiet about it, for as long as quiet was possible. I asked her how long we had before someone might notice. She said that the moment we filed, it became public record. "There's no way to do this invisibly," she said, "but we can move quickly." We filed on a Friday afternoon. By the following Wednesday, my phone rang. It was Garrett. He had not called me in over 2 years. His voice was pleasant in a way that reminded me of Pamela's pleasant voice at Harold's funeral, that particular pleasantness that sits on top of something else entirely. "Dorothy," he said, "how are you? I've been meaning to reach out." "Hello, Garrett," I said. "I heard you've been in touch with an attorney in Columbus." A pause. "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Is there anything I can help you with?" I had expected this, or something like it. Susan had warned me that a title search would be visible. What I hadn't expected was how quickly it had happened. 4 business days, which meant Garrett had someone watching, which meant he had been watching for years. "Everything is fine," I said. "Thank you for calling." I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand and felt the full weight of what Harold had been protecting me from. He had known. He had known exactly what Garrett was, and he had spent years engineering a situation in which I could be safe before the fight began. The following Monday, Susan called me with the results of the title search. The land was clean as expected, but she had found something additional, something Harold apparently hadn't known, or perhaps hadn't had time to include in his letter. In 2022, the year after Harold's death, Garrett had filed a quiet title action attempting to claim the Reardon parcel, arguing that Harold had died intestate with respect to that specific asset. The action had been filed in a county court and had been pending for 3 years without resolution. Because there had been no opposing party, no one to contest it since no one on my side had known the land existed. The case had been proceeding entirely without me. I read Susan's email 3 times. Then I printed it and drove to her office without an appointment, and she saw me immediately because she is that kind of lawyer. We sat together and looked at the court documents, Garrett's attorney's filings, the case number, the procedural history, and I felt something settle in me like concrete hardening. This was not suspicion anymore. This was evidence. Garrett had known about the land, had waited for Harold to die, and had moved to take it through the courts before I could ever discover it existed. "Can we intervene in the existing action?" I asked. "Not only can we," Susan said, "we must, and we have grounds. The deed, the settlement, Harold's letter, all of it establishes your legitimate claim beyond any reasonable dispute." She paused. "Dorothy, I want to be honest with you. This will become contentious. Garrett's attorney will not step back quietly." "I know," I said. I picked up my purse. "Do what needs to be done." Susan filed our intervention in the quiet title action the following week. We attached the deed, the 1994 settlement, Harold's letter, and a sworn affidavit from me detailing the circumstances of discovery. The filing was, in Susan's words, airtight. In my words, it was 47 years of a good man's careful love, finally speaking for itself in a court of law. 3 days later, Garrett came to my house. He didn't call first. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with Pamela, and they knocked on my front door the way people knock when they want to appear casual but have rehearsed it. 2 sharp raps, and then a step back to look unthreatening. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment before I answered. Pamela was holding a dish covered in foil, a casserole apparently, the props of a social visit. I opened the door. Dorothy. Garrett smiled. Pamela smiled. We were in the area. We brought food. Come in, I said. I did not want them in my house, but I wanted to hear what they had to say, and I had spoken with Susan that morning specifically about this possibility, and she had told me, say nothing about the case. Confirm nothing. Deny nothing. Just listen. We sat at the kitchen table. Pamela unwrapped the casserole, something with chicken, it smelled fine, and poured coffee as though she lived there, which I found I minded more than I'd expected. Garrett talked for a while about nothing, his kids, their new house, the weather in Columbus, and then he said carefully, I heard you've gotten a lawyer involved in the property matter. I have a lawyer, yes, I said. Dorothy. He leaned forward. I want to speak plainly. That land, the Reardon parcel, Dad always meant for that to come to me. You know that. We both know that. He told me so himself before he got sick. His eyes were steady and sincere. He had practiced this. I don't want there to be conflict between us. I would hate for this to get ugly. But if you push forward with this, I'm going to have to protect my interests. And my attorney tells me we have grounds to argue that Harold was not mentally competent in the final years. I set down my coffee cup. Garrett, I said, Harold was sharper at 65 than most men are at 30. And you know that his handling of this asset reflected a deterioration in judgment. He continued, as though I hadn't spoken. I want to give you the opportunity to step back from this voluntarily. It would be better for everyone. Pamela nodded sadly beside him. I looked at them both. A threat wrapped in concern delivered over a chicken casserole. Harold had known exactly who they were. I appreciate you coming, I said. I'll pass your thoughts along to my attorney. Garrett's expression changed. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second, the pleasantness slipped. Dorothy, I'm trying to help you avoid. I heard you, I said. Thank you for the food. They left. I stood in my kitchen and listened to their car back out of the driveway. Then I sat down and my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the physical reality of confrontation. The body's response to threat regardless of how calm the mind remains. I called Susan immediately and reported every word. She was unsurprised. She told me the competency argument was a common tactic and had essentially no chance of success given Harold's professional record, his clear documentation, and the timeline. They're hoping you'll be frightened into settling, she said. Don't be. That week, Susan filed a motion to dismiss Garrett's quiet title claim on the grounds that it had been filed in bad faith by a party who had no legal standing. She attached documentation showing Garrett had been aware of the contested nature of the land's ownership prior to filing. The motion was aggressive, precise, and exactly right. Then she told me to take a week and rest. You've done the hard part for now, she said. Let the court work. I drove to my sister Carol's house in Indiana and spent 4 days there, sleeping longer than I had in years, eating Carol's cooking, walking in the evenings along the path by the river. I did not think about Garrett or Pamela or the land for entire hours at a time. I thought about Harold and about the folding chair he had placed in that underground room, facing the safe, as though setting a place for me at a table. He had thought of everything. The least I could do was think of the rest. When I returned from Carol's, there was an envelope in my mailbox. It had been sent by Garrett's attorney. A formal letter, not a legal filing, but a good faith communication, as it called itself. The letter outlined a settlement offer. Garrett would drop his quiet title claim, and in return I would agree to split the proceeds from any future sale of the Reardon parcel, 50-50, acknowledging what the letter described as Harold's clear intention to provide for his son. I read the letter on the porch with my coffee, and then I set it on the side table and finished my coffee. There was a robin working the lawn near the garden fence, pulling something from the soil with a business-like persistence I found admirable. I watched it for a while. The offer was not nothing. $1.15 million was not a figure to dismiss without reflection. I am a reasonable woman. I reflected. But the reflection kept returning to the same point. Harold had gone to extraordinary lengths, at great personal effort and over many years, to ensure this inheritance reached me intact and undiminished. A 50-50 split was not what he had built. It was precisely what he had worked to prevent. To accept it would be to hand Garrett exactly what he had tried to take through deception. I forwarded the letter to Susan with a one-line message. My answer is no. Susan called that afternoon. She told me our motion to dismiss had generated what she called judicial interest. The judge had requested supplemental briefing from both parties, which in Susan's reading meant the court was taking our bad faith argument seriously. This is moving in your favor, she said. Hold your position. I told Ruth about the settlement offer that Thursday when she came for dinner. I hadn't told Ruth everything from the beginning. I'd been careful, not wanting to involve her unnecessarily, but I had told her enough, and she had kept it in confidence the way Ruth always kept things. She listened to the whole story that night over pot roast, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Harold loved you very much." "I know," I said. "And you're not going to take that offer." "No." She nodded as though that settled it. Then she said, "Do you need anything? I mean practically. Are you managing?" The question undid me a little, the way practical kindness from a longtime friend can. I told her I was managing. I told her I had Susan, and Carol had offered to come and stay if things escalated, and my son Patrick knew the broad strokes now. I had finally told him the week before, and he was supportive and careful and had offered to come to Ohio, which I had told him wasn't necessary yet. That was true. I had finally told Patrick. He had taken it with the measured gravity he brought to most things. He was angry on my behalf, which I found I needed someone to be, because I myself was not operating on anger. I was operating on something steadier and colder, a kind of determination that sat below emotion, in the part of you that simply knows what is right and proceeds accordingly. I also, that week, joined a small legal support group for widows navigating estate disputes, which a counselor at my church had quietly mentioned existed. It met on Tuesday evenings at the community center. 6 women, various circumstances, a facilitator, who was a retired social worker. I am not a person who joins groups easily, But I sat there the first Tuesday and listened to a woman named Elaine describe a situation remarkably similar to mine. A stepchild, a hidden asset, a fight she had not chosen but was finishing. And I felt for the first time in months entirely not alone. Garrett and Pamela sent a fruit basket 2 weeks after the settlement letter. No note. I thanked them in a text message and said nothing further. I could feel them watching, waiting for a sign of weakness, some crack in the surface through which doubt might seep. There was no crack. I had sealed it with Harold's index card, the one I kept now in my coat pocket, the one that said, "Everything inside belongs to you." Garrett called on a Saturday morning in October to say he and Pamela were going to be passing through Millbrook. They had friends in the area, he said, purely coincidental, and would I mind if they stopped for an hour? His tone was different this time, softer, more careful. The aggression of the kitchen table visit had been replaced by something that, in another context, might have passed for genuine remorse. I said yes because I was not afraid of them, and because I had spoken with Susan the previous week, and she had told me we were waiting on the court's ruling on our motion, expected within the month. I had nothing to hide and nothing to lose from letting Garrett speak. They arrived at 2 p.m, no casserole this time. They sat in my living room and Garrett looked around at the photographs on the mantel. Harold and me at Carol's wedding, Harold in the vegetable garden, Harold at Patrick's college graduation, with an expression that was either grief or a skillful imitation of it. "Dorothy," he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. The way I handled this has been wrong. I was angry after Dad died and I felt, cut out. And I let that turn into something I'm not proud of. He paused. "I know you loved my father. I know he loved you. I don't want to be fighting with you over property. It's not who I want to be." Pamela reached over and touched my hand. "We've been praying about this," she said. "We really have. And we feel like the right thing, the Christian thing, is to let go of the legal claim entirely. We're willing to do that." She looked at me with earnest eyes. "All we'd ask is that you consider in your estate planning, not now, not as a legal matter, just personally, informally, acknowledging that Harold had a son. That's all. A gesture of goodwill." There it was. The settlement offer had been 50%. The new ask was softer. Just goodwill. Just a personal, informal acknowledgement. Just a mention in my will, which of course would be legally binding in practice, while remaining deniable as coercion in the moment. I looked at Pamela's hand on mine. I looked at Garrett's careful, sorrowful eyes, and I thought of Harold's note. I needed to be sure you were safe first. He'd not been speaking abstractly. He had known this room, this conversation, this particular performance of grief and reasonableness. "I appreciate what you're saying," I said. "I do. And I have no wish to be at war with you, Garrett. Your father was a good man, and I know he loved you." Garrett's shoulders relaxed slightly. "But I'm not going to make informal arrangements about my estate in a living room conversation," I continued. "If you want to drop the legal claim, I think that would be the right thing to do. And my estate is my own business, and I'll manage it with my attorney and my family the way Harold managed his." The softness left Garrett's face. Not all at once. He was too controlled for that. But it drained, slowly like water, finding the lowest point. Pamela's hand withdrew from mine. Dorothy." His voice was flat now. "You're making a mistake. You're an old woman living alone, and this is going to drag on in court for years, and it's going to cost you, and in the end—" "In the end," I said, "the court will decide based on the evidence." I stood up. That was the end of the meeting. He stood too, and for a moment he was very still in my living room among Harold's photographs, in Harold's house, and I could see the anger in him, hot and close to the surface. He mastered it. He said, "I'm fine. We'll see it through then." They left. I locked the front door and stood in the hallway, and I will not pretend I wasn't frightened. I was, not of Garrett physically. He was not that kind of man, but of the machinery of a prolonged legal fight, of the expense, of the sheer grinding weight of being opposed. But the fear had a quality I recognized. It was the kind that doesn't stop you, the kind that clarifies. I went to my desk and wrote Susan a full account of the visit. Then I made dinner, watched the evening news, and went to bed. In the morning, there was work to do. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in November. Susan and I drove to Columbus together in her car, and I watched Ohio November passing outside the window. Gray fields, dripped trees, the sky the particular flat white of the Midwest in autumn, and felt something that was not quite calm, but functioned like it. Harold had prepared for this day from the year he first understood what Garrett intended. I was simply the final step in a plan 40 years in the making. I had not slept well the night before. Not from fear, I want to be precise about that, but from the particular alertness of a person who understands that something long in motion is about to stop. I lay in the dark of Harold's house and went through the facts the way you go through a list before a long trip, checking each item. The deed, the settlement, the letter, the clerk's communication, each one solid, each one real. By the time the alarm went off at 6, I had already been awake for an hour, and I felt strangely prepared, the way you feel after prayer or after a very long exhale. The courtroom was unremarkable. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the hushed institutional efficiency of a place where serious things are decided without ceremony. Garrett and Pamela sat at the opposing table with their attorney, a man named Vickers I had seen only in photographs. Garrett wore a dark suit and did not look at me when we came in. Pamela sat very straight, her hands folded on the table, dressed in a muted burgundy that I suspected had been chosen carefully. They looked, I thought, like people who had rehearsed looking composed. Susan presented our case in 40 minutes. She was clear, organized, and thorough. The deed, the settlement, Harold's letter, the timeline. She presented evidence, which our investigator had obtained through public records, showing that Garrett had been in contact with a county clerk in 2021, shortly after Harold's death, inquiring about the Reardon parcel's ownership status. That contact had preceded his quiet title filing by 3 months. He had known the land existed. He had moved to claim it knowing that I did not know, exploiting a window of ignorance Harold had tried to close and Garrett had tried to hold open. Vickers objected twice. Judge Osei overruled both times with the brisk precision of someone who had already read the briefs carefully. Then it was Vickers' turn. He argued the competency angle, briefly because he knew it was weak. He argued that Harold's letter was not a legal document and could not substitute for explicit testamentary direction. He argued that the 1994 settlement, while valid, did not automatically transfer the land to Harold's marital estate without additional documentation. Susan stood for rebuttal and addressed each point in turn, methodically, without theater. And then Judge Osei asked Garrett a question directly. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Mr. Garrett Callahan, I'm looking at Exhibit 14, which is your communication with the county clerk's office in September of 2021. In that communication, you described the Reardon parcel as an asset I have reason to believe my father held without documentation. Can you tell me the basis for that belief at the time?" Garrett looked at Vickers. Vickers gave him nothing. "I had conversations with my father," Garrett said. "Your father died in August of 2021. You state in this communication that you have reason to believe. Can you be specific?" We spoke about it generally before he passed." "Before he passed, your father was ill from March of that year. His medical records, which we have in evidence, indicate significant incapacitation beginning in June. Prior to June, do you have documentation of any conversation about this specific parcel?" "Not documentation, no. It was a personal conversation." "I see." Judge Osei made a note. "Mr. Vickers, your client filed a quiet title action in 2022, asserting that his father had died intestate with respect to this asset. Your client now testifies that his father discussed the asset with him personally. Can you help me understand why a son who had been told by his father about this asset would file an intestacy claim rather than, for example, a claim based on his father's express intention?" Vickers stood. "Your Honor, because an intestacy claim requires there to have been no intention expressed," Judge Osei continued, as though he hadn't spoken, "and a claim based on express intention requires evidence of that intention. Which is it, Mr. Vickers?" The room was quiet. I looked at my hands in my lap. I did not look at Garrett because I did not need to. I could hear in the silence the architecture of his argument collapsing. I thought in that silence about all the rooms this story had passed through. My bedroom, where I found the envelope. The garage, cold and smelling of oil. The underground room with its folding chair and its carefully labeled boxes. Susan's glass office building in Columbus. My kitchen table, where Garrett had delivered his threat over chicken casserole. And now this room, fluorescent, ordinary, utterly decisive. Harold had built a path from one to the next. I had only followed it. "Your Honor," Vickers said, "we would request a brief recess." "We'll take 10 minutes," she said. During those 10 minutes, Susan and I sat together in the hallway on a wooden bench, and she said nothing because she understood I didn't need anything said. I watched people move through the corridor, clerks, attorneys, a young man carrying a box of files. And I thought about Harold coming out to the garage in pain to oil a hatch so it would open easily for me. I thought about him sitting in that underground room, writing a 4-page letter to the woman he had been married to for 47 years, explaining, apologizing, and trusting. When we returned, Judge Osei delivered a bench ruling. Garrett's quiet title claim was dismissed with prejudice. The deed to the Reardon parcel was confirmed as a valid asset of Harold Callahan's estate, properly transferred to Dorothy Callahan as the surviving spouse. Court costs were awarded against the filing party. She looked at Garrett as she said it, the way judges sometimes do when they want the ruling to land fully on the person it concerns. Garrett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hands, flat on the table in front of him, pressed down slightly as if he needed the solidity of the surface beneath him. Pamela stared straight ahead. Neither of them spoke. Vickers gathered his papers with the careful neutrality of a professional who has learned to lose without expression, though I noticed his movements were faster than they needed to be. Garrett did not look at me as we left. Pamela was crying quietly, which surprised me. I had expected anger. The drive back from Columbus was quiet. Susan and I stopped at a diner outside the city, the kind of place with vinyl booths and good pie, and we ordered coffee and she ordered apple pie and I ordered cherry. And she said, "Dorothy, in 20 years of practice, I have rarely seen a case this clean." And I said, "Harold was a careful man." And she said, He was very careful." And we sat there for a while in the comfortable silence of two women who have just watched something right happen in a courtroom. Outside the diner window, the November fields stretched flat and gray toward the horizon. A grain elevator stood in the middle distance, white against the pale sky. Ohio in winter has a particular kind of beauty that requires patience to appreciate. It doesn't announce itself, it simply persists. I had always loved it. Harold had too. He used to say this was a landscape for people who paid attention, and I had always thought he was talking about farming. But sitting there in that diner booth, I understood he'd been talking about something larger than that. In the weeks that followed, the legal picture resolved itself with the clean efficiency of things that are actually settled. The title to the Reardon parcel was formally recorded in my name. The developer, a Columbus-based firm that had been buying up land in the corridor for years, had in fact been in contact with Harold's estate through an intermediary as early as 2020, and Susan discovered this through the records. When I authorized her to reach out to them formally as the established title holder, they responded within a week. The negotiations took 2 months. I hired a commercial real estate attorney in addition to Susan on Susan's recommendation, because the transaction required a different kind of expertise. I was patient. I did not rush. Harold had waited 5 years for me to be ready. I could wait 2 months for the right number. The land sold in February for $2.1 million. After taxes, legal fees, and the commission to the real estate attorney, I received $1.74 million. I sat at my kitchen table the evening the wire transfer confirmed and looked at the number on my laptop screen for a long time. It was a number Harold had earned, not at a desk, not in a meeting, but through decades of quiet, careful watching, through the patience to see a threat clearly and plan against it not in anger, but in love. I called Patrick that same evening after I had sat with the number long enough that it felt real. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mom," in the voice he uses when words are insufficient. And that was enough. We talked for an hour. At some point I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, about the folding chair in the underground room, about Harold's characteristic practicality even in secrecy. And Patrick laughed too, and it was the first time in a long time that Harold's memory had made me laugh instead of ache. That felt like its own kind of victory. Garrett appealed the court ruling. His attorney filed within the 30-day window as Susan had anticipated. The appellate court took 4 months to review the record and affirmed Judge Osei's ruling without oral argument, which, Susan explained, was the appellate court's way of indicating that the challenge lacked sufficient merit to warrant a hearing. Garrett's appeal was dismissed. His attorney sent a final letter to Susan indicating that her client would pursue no further legal action. I read that letter at my kitchen table, too. It was 2 sentences long. I want to be precise about how I felt, because I think it matters to say it correctly. I did not feel triumph exactly. I felt a deep, settled rightness. The feeling of a door closing properly on its frame after years of sticking. Harold had been cheated of the chance to give me this himself, in the ordinary way, without secrecy or drama or underground rooms. Garrett had taken that from us, but he had not taken the thing itself. He had tried carefully and deliberately for years, and he had failed, and the failure was complete. I donated $50,000 to the hospital in Millbrook that had cared for Harold in his final months. I set aside a trust for my grandchildren's education. I gave a meaningful gift to Patrick, who had supported me through the whole ordeal quietly and without pressure. I bought myself, for the first time in my life, a new car. Nothing extravagant, a sensible sedan in a shade of blue I liked. Because Harold had always handled the car purchases, and I had always felt I should defer to him on it. And I realize now that I didn't need to defer to anyone on a color. Susan and I had lunch together the following spring. A real lunch, not a work lunch. And she brought her daughter, who was applying to law schools, and I told the daughter that the most useful thing a lawyer could do was listen carefully to elderly women, because elderly women were usually paying close attention to things everyone else had stopped watching. Susan laughed. Her daughter wrote something in her phone. The Reardon parcel, all 11 acres, is now the site of a mixed-use commercial development. I drove past it once, in the fall, just to see. There's a coffee shop on the corner. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes and looked at it. The clean new building, the glass storefront, the young couple coming out with cups in their hands, entirely unaware of the history underneath their feet. 11 acres of Ohio farmland that a man had quietly protected for 30 years through litigation and secrecy and a locked room and a sealed envelope and an enormous act of faith in the woman he loved. I thought Harold would have found that funny. He never drank coffee. He always drank tea. Spring came to Millbrook the way it always does. Slowly at first, then all at once. The forsythia along my back fence went yellow overnight in March, and the vegetable garden, which I had let go somewhat during the legal ordeal, called me back to it with the particular insistence of living things that require attention. I spent a long weekend turning the soil and planning the season's planting, and I felt, kneeling in the garden Harold had made, something I can only describe as permission. Permission to continue. Permission to be well. I will not catalog everything that changed in the year that followed, because the truth is that a great deal did not change. I still live in the same house. I still have coffee on the back porch every morning. I still have Ruth for dinner on Thursdays. These things were not broken and did not need replacing. What changed was something interior, a quality of ease that I hadn't known was missing until it returned. I traveled for the first time in 12 years. Carol and I went to Portugal in the fall, a trip we had discussed vaguely since our 30s and never taken. We spent 2 weeks in Lisbon and then drove north along the coast, staying in small hotels, eating things we couldn't identify but loved, walking more than our feet approved of. I called it a trip, and Carol called it a restoration. She wasn't wrong. Patrick and his family visited at Christmas. His children are 9 and 12 now, and they are exactly the kind of children Harold would have spent hours with in the garden, teaching them things in the patient way he had. I watched them at the dinner table and felt the specific happiness of continuity, of a family that holds together across time. My membership in the estate dispute support group had lapsed during the most active legal period, but I returned to it as a volunteer facilitator after the case resolved. There were always new members. There were always women sitting in that room who needed someone to say, "You are not imagining it. You are not alone. You can do this." I had been that woman. Now I could be the other thing. As for Garrett and Pamela, I heard things, as one does in a world connected by family and proximity, even when contact has officially ceased. Garrett's attorney, Vickers, dropped him as a client after the appeal failed. The legal fees from the combined campaign had been substantial. Garrett had financed them, Susan believed, partly through a refinancing of his Columbus home. In the 18 months following the appeal dismissal, Garrett and Pamela separated. The house was sold. I heard this from Harold's niece, who remained in sporadic contact with me and had no particular loyalty to Garrett's side of the story. The separation was, by all accounts, acrimonious. Pamela moved to Phoenix to be near her sister. Garrett moved to a smaller place in a suburb south of Columbus. I do not know what Garrett's daily life looks like now. I do not think about it often, but I will say this. The decisions he made, to watch, to file, to lie in a courtroom, to come to my kitchen table with a casserole and a threat, those decisions had consequences. Not because I pursued consequences against him, but because that is how decisions work. They echo forward. Harold understood that. He had watched Garrett for years and had not acted out of anger. He had acted out of love, in the only direction love was available to him. He could not change who Garrett was. He could only protect what was mine. I planted tomatoes in the same corner of the garden where Harold always planted them. I used his stakes and his ties and his careful spacing. They came in well that summer. "Better than usual," Ruth said. "She's probably right. She usually is." So that is the story of the envelope, the garage, and the room beneath the floor. What would you have done? Would you have opened that envelope? Leave a comment. I read every single one. Share this if it stayed with you. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourselves.